Alrighty, welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill. Barnhill. Okay, so a good kid's book in my mind is like a poem. It is lyrical. It doesn't always make complete literal sense. It's all about feeling and water-painted scenery. The shape of the characters and even the story itself sometimes is drawn as much from the space between the words as the words themselves. This book is a poem, which is also just fun because poetry is a major set piece in this book. Okay, so the story of this book, it's about a place called the Protectorate and the dangerous forest that borders it. The people of the Protectorate know that as long as they are willing to sacrifice the youngest baby in their land once every year, the witch will leave them alone. What they do not know is that the witch, Zan, has no interest in the Protectorate. She has no idea why a random baby is left in the woods every year. But she does know that if she left the baby there and left it alone there, it would die. And so every year she hikes to the grove where the babies are left, collects them, and takes them to the free cities on the other side of the forest to find them an adoptive family where they can live happily. Until one year, when the baby that is left, a little girl with big dark eyes and a crescent-shaped birthmark on her forehead, a little girl whose mother loved her to the point of madness, a little girl whose eyes stare straight through everyone, is left. And Zan accidentally feeds her moonlight, which she knows will enmagic the girl. And because the baby is now magic, she cannot just be adopted out to any random family. So Zan raises the child herself, naming the girl Luna, and waiting for the day when Luna's magic will rise. A magic so big and bright, it might change the world. And I absolutely loved this book. It is soft and gentle, but serious and deep. It is poetic and metaphorical, but also silly and playful. It has an amazingly likable cast of characters, a rich world, and a surprisingly complex storytelling. This book does one of my favorite things to see in kids' books. It takes metaphors and symbolic ideas and makes them literal and real. Someone who enjoys the pain of others might be said to eat sorrow, but in this book, sorrow can be literal food, keeping a person alive, and it's something that can be farmed like any other resource. Someone walking at night enjoying a pleasant night might be said to be drinking in the moonlight. But this book, moonlight can be turned into something physical that can literally be drinking like anything else. Drunk? Whichever. And I love this. Most kids in the target age range of books like this, because this is middle grade, they don't literally have the ability to parse metaphors yet. They aren't reading a book saying, ah yes, the curtains are red in this scene to represent the blood and violence and anger blocking out the greater world and caging our main character in. But the thing that a lot of people miss is that even if kids are not getting like the literal I can explain on paper why this is this way part of the metaphor, they do get the feeling of the symbolism and imagery usually. They might get that the curtains are red because red equals anger, but they might not even be able to express that in words. And this is the way that a lot of kids' books use symbolism. It tends to be very simple and straightforward and emotive. And that's all it needs to be. And like, I would argue that honestly, in books for adults, kids, everyone, and for that matter, all forms of media, that is how symbolism is supposed to work. I feel like because we're taught to like literally evaluate it in school so we can, ingest it better, we get this idea that good symbolism is stuff that you should have to like pull out a dictionary and be like, ah yes, what does a tree symbolize in this scene? I don't know. Let me look up the qualities of an oak tree. But no, symbolism is, like the best symbolism at least, is the stuff you don't have to stop reading and examine, evaluate, and parse. The best symbolism is the stuff that you just get the vibes without devoting too much brain space to it. But the way metaphor is used in a lot of literature doesn't really work as well for kids because of this. Often symbolism is placed in such a way that if you do not get what the metaphor is directly saying, you are missing something. And you know you are missing something. The text feels empty, and sometimes it even gets to the point that you don't know what's going on unless you understand that symbolism. Like a good example of this is the movie Mother. I jokingly called that movie Oops, All Symbolism. The movie doesn't make any logical sense if you take it literally. There is barely a story outside of the metaphor. If you don't get the biblical allegory, you don't know what is happening. If you took a child to that movie, I guess because you wanted to traumatize them, there is no other reason to show a child that movie, but they would not know what the hell is happening. But on the other side of that, if you then take that metaphor and make it literal, as a simple statement of what is literally happening in the story, it makes sense in the story, it works as part of the world, and is treated as just part of the way the world works, those who aren't old enough to get the symbolism still know what is going on. They understand the story. They probably get the vibes off of the metaphor, and as they mature, they might come back and pick up the nuance. So it goes from, cool, she drank the moon, to, the moon represents love, and the moon is usually associated with the feminine, so drinking the moonlight is a metaphor for growing in a distinctly feminine power by ingesting a mother's love. But also, this literalizing of metaphor just leads to a more interesting and creative world. And Lord, do I love the world of this book. It was one that felt very familiar and novel at the same time. There's a creation myth that I'm pretty sure I haven't actually heard anywhere else before, but also there's a lot of world building that felt like it came from all over the world, which creates this feeling of sort of fairy tale-ishness. And I also just loved the way the world evolved and was introduced throughout the book. There's this magic thing that fairy tale-like books can do, where in the beginning you feel like, yeah, I get this world. You probably think, yes, this is a simple fairy tale-like world, I understand everything I'm going to need to understand. You are introduced to a lot of familiar-looking things, and maybe a couple of novel concepts, but everything is introduced very simply and quickly, explained, everything is simple. You think you are in a simple world. But then the author starts building. We keep getting hints of deeper complexity, and about halfway through the book, you're suddenly realizing you have no idea what is really happening in the world. And this book does that specifically through building memory and the forgotten. Zan seems like a very simple character in the beginning. You sort of just assume she has lived most of her life in the woods, the way you assume the grandma in Little Red Riding Hood has probably lived her entire life in the woods. Then you find out that she had a teacher, and you're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Of course, she knows magic, she had to learn it from someone. Then you learn that she used to live in a castle. And then you learn that she was a foundling, maybe? And slowly you realize that there was an entire society here, and there was this apocalyptic disaster, and she has purposely forgotten so much. And it all sort of reminds me of the way that when you're a little kid, your parents are just your mom and dad. In your mind, that is their entire identity. Of course you feel like you know them, but more importantly, and more to the point, you feel like you know all of them. You assume that how they are around you is the only way they ever are or have ever been. But as you get older, you yourself become more complex, and therefore the relationship with them becomes more complex, and you finally get to see the complexity of who they are when they, are not around you. And at some point, you just sort of realize that your parents had an entire identity and a life before you that you never knew and you never could know. And the way you often learn that is through them sharing memories with you. And that is how the entire world expands in this book. We get flashes of memories, and those memories show us a world that is so different than the current world that we just slowly realize there's a lot more complex, world building going on than we see at the first. I also just love what the author is doing with memories here, how our memories shape us, how we develop memories even when we don't think we are listening, what we choose to forget, and how that can be a shield and can be a dagger. And I'm not even sure I know all of what the author was doing with memory here, because amazingly there's just so much going on in this book. There's also a lovely examination of time, aging, and growing, how place and trauma and even family can sort of freeze us in time and prevent us from growing, but also the inevitability of that ticking clock and how we can grow in really uneven ways. The other main theme is sorrow, and it's very simple and very in your face and very straightforward, but also surprisingly layered. Sorrow is a weapon, sorrow is dangerous, sorrow makes us mad, but sorrow makes us powerful. Sorrow is cruel, but it can also be the only spark of good in someone. And its inverse is hope, which is beautiful and joyful and light and powerful, but it can also be the wall that prevents us from acting when we should. Zan should have chosen not to forgotten, but she did so out of hope of blocking sorrow and living in peace. And, like, I just keep going back to it. I love this book. I love it when really serious, hard themes can be tackled in a book that is so whimsical and playful and sweet. This book made me cry and healed my heart and felt like it taught me something in a way that poetry is supposed to. And it was a really quick read. I could probably have read this one in 2 days easily had I wanted to, but I didn't want to. I wanted to inhabit this world a bit longer. I will definitely reread this one at some point, and I really want to read more from the author. But I should mention what faults I found in it. First, I will say the climax feels a little like it was trying to do something that this book was not built to do. There's a bit of an attempt at action, like fighting and running and danger, but the style of the book is so dreamlike that it doesn't really feel like it fits. It felt a little bit like as if Emily Dickinson had written a fight scene, like that sort of cognitive dissonance. And I feel like the author recognized that it wasn't working, so we just sort of rushed through the action-y bit as quickly as possible to get to the more emotional, conflicty climax section. But then that climax ended up feeling a little bit anticlimactic. Adding to that feeling of anticlimacticness is the fact that there's a lot of foreshadowing that the climax of this is going to be a showdown between Zan and the Sorrow Eater, and that didn't really happen. Like, they exchanged maybe a couple of lines of dialogue in a scene where there are half dozen other characters. Which, I mean, was partially the point. It's very much a scene about love and family versus lone power kind of thing going on. But it felt like we had been robbed of a much more dramatic climax. I also wish we had focused a little bit more on the ethene section of the falling action. But also, now that I think about it, like, I wouldn't have minded if we had spent some more of the climax time with that character. Seeing what she was doing off screen, she honestly was just this great character who was a bit underutilized. I also have some qualms about associating madness with magic, just because there's too much in our culture implying that mental illness is somehow necessary for creativity and vision, and that has a really adverse effect on people being willing to seek help for mental illnesses. But even though part of my mind was flashing danger signals with all that, being like, ooh, this could be problematic, I still sort of loved the way the madwoman worked in this book, and I think that comes from the fact that she is presented as having already had the ability for magic inside of her, and it was her love that drove her to be able to access it. But I don't know, it might just be that I loved the book enough that I'm willing to ignore problematic elements. I am prone to do that. But it's something you should be aware is in this. If that's something that's going to make you uncomfortable, be aware it's here. And also, I feel like for a book that leans very heavily on themes of consequences and accepting change and endings, there's a certain part of the ending that felt a little bit like a cop-out. But none of those faults were enough to really mar my enjoyment of this book. Overall, I just loved it. I thought it was absolutely beautifully done. It's emotional. It's got some serious depth. There's so much going on in this book thematically and with symbolism that I am 100% sure I missed some of it. And I just haven't parsed other bits of it. I didn't even touch on the symbolism of paper and poetry that is in this book. And that's partially because I'm not entirely sure I understand it fully enough to put it into words yet. But I don't feel like I need to. I feel like it's in my heart and soul, so I'm happy with that. I was just happy to live in the feelings and the beautiful imagery in this book. Overall, it's a beautiful, meaningful book, but it's also just a fun story about a little girl growing up and saving the world from a volcano. You know, normal girl stuff.